in the early hours of the morning of the 30th of December, we were woken up to the most amazing thunderstorm. It was that very point where we were concerned that we were in for something pretty sinister. On daybreak, we just saw fires burning, and they just got the intensity of those fires increased. It was just big plumes of smoke, and that advance from the northwest was heading down towards the chase. On the evening of the 2nd of January, it looked like there was a wind change and it was heading back towards Cape Border. The feeling was, as it went north, that they got the fire in check. And then in a very short space of time, the next morning, on the morning of the 3rd of January, it all hell broke loose.
Personal cost of the fire on the community, because you had generations, and I knew people where 3 generations in a family had been burned. And so normally in a traumatic situation, there's people who aren't so closely affected, the ones that you go to, your friends or your family that you go to for that support. But there were so many cases when you had a couple of generations or even 3 generations. A family that might have 3 children, and all of them had lost their properties, and the parents as well. So the strength of the community lay in support that people gave to each other, but because you had a traumatised community, even those who, like us, we didn't lose our house, even though our property was burned, that strength was hard to give all the time, because you also needed to be able to receive that support.
Following the 2019-2020 bushfires here on Western Kangaroo Island, there's a big knowledge gap in how a certain suite of species respond to fire. There are a number of rare and endemic plants here on Western Kangaroo Island, and very little was known about their host fire ecology.
So fire has been a part of this system for a long time. And because of that, these plants have evolved like adaptations to benefit or to at least tolerate fire. On Kangaroo Island and most of Australia, we've got species that usually can recover in 2 main ways. So they'll have a seed bank, or they'll resprout. A whole suite of species, particularly like small species, they're like early successional plants. So they'll use fire as like an opportunity to then like emerge without like all these big trees around them, and then quickly flower and put out their seeds, and then they'll die again.
So if an area doesn't get burnt, it eventually becomes more and more senescent, in that you end up with a very dominant overstory, but very little understory, because that overstory takes all the moisture out of the soil, as well as having a closed canopy, and so therefore the shrubs just don't have the light or the water to survive. When your bushfire goes through, it kind of just resets the whole thing. So your canopy's gone, it lets a lot of the light in, it also cues a lot of the seeds to actually germinate.
There's other plants that are super specialized in fire to the point where they have seeds that can detect fire. So one of the endangered plants on Kangaroo Island that does this is Alaria macrodisca. This species has a seed bank, so a seed that can detect smoke. So it really only germinates in sustainable quantities if it can detect smoke. So what we'll see is these plants pretty much disappearing if there's no fire in the system, and then disturbance, like fire, will happen and we'll get heaps of them coming up. And then eventually they'll drop out again and need another fire. Fire's not necessarily bad, but obviously these recent bushfires, that was too much fire.
Nature Conservation Society of South Australia is a non-government organisation that has been advocating for nature conservation in South Australia for almost 60 years. Kangaroo Island is home for 60 plant species which are endemic to the island. That means they only occur on the island, and most of these species are rare or threatened. Many of these plants are confined to the western end of the island, which was totally burnt out by the fire in 2020.
Kangaroo Island's been isolated from mainland Australia for over 10,000 years. So you have a lot of similar organisms here on the island, but they differ just slightly. So that 10,000 year window of separation is just enough time to let the biodiversity on Kangaroo Island evolve on its own trajectory and adapt to the unique characteristics of Kangaroo Island. A big part of what brought us here to Kangaroo Island is to study these 17 species and assess how they would respond after this fire. Are they going to regenerate? Are they going to regenerate from seed? Are they going to regenerate from reshooting from a perennial rootstock? A lot of these questions didn't have answers, and to conserve these species into the future, it was really important that we get a better understanding of how these plants would respond post-fire. So part of our project was assessing the threats to the particular species that we were looking at. And we didn't really know exactly what we were going to find. And when we got here, it was quite apparent that the most prolific and most urgent threat from a weeds perspective was Tasmanian Blue Gum, Eucalyptus globulus. And this plant is native to Tasmania, but also southern Victoria. It's a high rainfall species. It really needs a window of between 500 and 1,500 millimeters of rain per year. It was planted here extensively in the early 2000s as a hardwood plantation tree. It has a very quick turnaround. Once planted, it can be harvested within 10 years. There were numerous studies done on this species to assess its potential as an invasive species, and they all came out saying not really an issue. But the big thing that people overlooked was fire.
They were loaded with seed, and normally when the seed drops, it's outcompeted by the healthy native vegetation that's around, and the seed doesn't last, it's not viable in the ground. But as soon as you get a fire, it takes out all the competition from the native vegetation, this open ground. All the blue gums release their seed capsules, trillions of seeds released into the ground, and they just take over.
Another interesting thing that we don't really understand a lot about is that they're shading out other plants. They're growing in a very dense stand, and they're reducing the availability of light to the ground layer of the bush. So they're basically competing for the same space and resources that native plants would otherwise use. So what we've got in effect is hundreds of thousands of water-sucking machines. They are strong competitors, and they're growing really quickly. They're taking water that would otherwise be used by native plants and using it for their own benefit. When we came here and realized that Tasmanian blue gums escaping into the bushland was a serious threat, we decided that we probably should get out there and just start doing something about it. So basically what we did is go out and remove them. priority areas. We picked areas of native vegetation that were being infested by blue gums where our priority target species were growing.
It's actually probably an ecological catastrophe in my view, because if these Tasmanian blue gums get to flower and fruit and set seed, they will continue on forth and we will end up with really changed vegetation associations. We've got volunteers, not just NCSSA volunteers, there's numerous groups hand weeding the Tasmanian blue gums. It's got a foothold. It's going to be a big job. I hope everyone's appreciative of the work of the volunteers that are here. And you know, I was with them yesterday, and great people, doing a great job.
All the stuff that I'm learning at university, I can then consolidate into something that's real.
I'm studying wildlife conservation biology, so I'm really interested in helping in any way I can. I've learnt a lot about the endemic species on Kangaroo Island, and I've met great people.
What we've started is being picked up more and more by both local people and other groups, and so it's important to be amongst those people who are really trying and have a shared interest in conservation.
It's great to see all these groups coming together. We live on Church Road, so it's one area that we have a property with heritage bushland, so we have some of the rare and endangered species on our property and was fire affected. And also we border a blue gum plantation, and so we have had issues with Tasmanian blue gum infestation post-fire. We don't do anything, we'll lose some really important native vegetation that's unique to the island.
I was born on the island, and my family's been in 6 generations, so for me Kangaroo Island is just home. Rick identifying blue gums as being a major threat to the regeneration post-fire, he actually instigated a whole lot of other people in wanting to do the same thing.
What's been really helpful is having teams of other volunteers like Bush for Life, the nature conservation teams of students and so on coming and volunteering, so that sort of has bolstered our capacity.
Given that there is very little research done, particularly in Australia, on the impacts of blue gums as infestations, this has potential to provide some important data, and so yes, to be part of a project that's got some real learnings potentially out of it is really important.
These plantation growing trees, wrong species you see, local vegetation.
This is something that we don't actually have the right to turn our backs on, because this is something for the future.
Pulling out smelly Tassie blue gum tree. I'm in South Australia. Girl, you know that I've been fighting about diversity. Some people use their hand to pull out seedlings, others use a saw reciprocatingly. When these Tassie blue gums burn, they release all of the seed, growing and growing and growing and knocking out everything else it seems. I work hard for no wages, but I do it willingly. Removing smelly Tassie blue gum, save our biodiversity.